The planet Kyleta was unlike any place Dr. Emily Harlow had ever visited. Its beauty was striking, its colors vivid, and its alien landscape both lush and haunting. There was just one thing that was undeniably strange: the complete and utter silence. Not a bird called in the distance, not a leaf rustled in the wind. The air itself seemed to hang heavy, like a dense fog that refused to move. When Emily had first arrived, she had been taken aback by the stillness. She'd been stationed on several off-world research projects before, mostly planets that were barren or hostile in some way. But Kyleta, despite the silence, felt alive, and yet, it was as if someone had placed an invisible hand over the planet's ears, muffling everything. At first, she thought it was just a result of her excitement, a trick of her senses. Perhaps her mind was overstimulated by the newness of the environment. But soon, the oddity became undeniable. Emily began to notice how people seemed to adjust to the lack of sound with unnatural ease. It wasn't just that they were silent in their movements, there was a sense that they, too, had adjusted to the absence of noise. People walked softly, communicated in short, clipped phrases, and quickly became accustomed to relying on visual and nonverbal cues rather than sound. "Sometimes I forget we're not in a vacuum," said Captain Marcus Clark, one of the colony's leaders, with a dry smile one evening as they were walking back to their quarters. "It's like the whole damn planet is holding its breath." Emily had laughed at the time, not fully understanding how true his words were. But as the days passed, she began to feel it, the weight of Kyleta's silence pressing against her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, listening even in their most mundane moments. The first real clue came when she was out in the field with a few colleagues, collecting samples from the strange flora. They were in a dense forest-like region of the planet, where trees that looked like they could have grown on Earth twisted into impossible, surreal shapes. The leaves, if they could be called leaves, were like shimmering membranes that reflected the dim sunlight in an iridescent haze. "Can you hear that?" Emily asked, pausing mid-step, her eyes narrowing. Her colleague, Dr. James Talley, shook his head. "What are you talking about?" Emily strained her ears, trying to pick up any hint of a sound. There was nothing. The stillness was profound. But then, just at the edge of her hearing, a faint, whisper-like hum filled the air. It was barely perceptible, like a sound that was coming from deep inside her own mind, echoing in her skull. She looked around, her pulse quickening, but the others seemed unfazed. "Forget it," Emily muttered, half to herself. "I must be imagining it." But the whisper wouldn't leave her, hanging in the back of her mind like a distant memory. She thought she could almost make out words. But the longer she listened, the more elusive it became. Her heart raced. Had she heard something, or was she simply succumbing to the strange tension the planet seemed to radiate? That night, Emily lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She couldn't explain it, but something about Kyleta felt off. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way that silence stretched endlessly, as if it were part of the very fabric of the planet itself. Something was suppressing sound. Not just preventing it from being made, but somehow holding it back, controlling its very propagation. It was as if the planet's inhabitants, the mysterious alien species known as the Sena, had some control over the basic laws of physics itself. And then, there was the banging that happened just before dawn. The bang was so loud it shook her entire room. It echoed through the corridors of the research complex, vibrating the walls. Emily's heart skipped. She rushed outside to find several others already standing in the courtyard, looking bewildered, the stunned looks on their faces mirrored in the still, darkened sky above. The silence had been shattered, but only for a brief moment. And then, like a switch flipping, it was gone again, leaving only the faint hum in her ears. "What the hell was that?" Captain Clark asked, his brow furrowed. "Anyone else hear that?" "Yeah," Emily replied, voice strained. "What is going on here?" But no one had an answer. They stood there for several moments, waiting for something, anything, to break the quiet again. But it didn't. The silence was complete, as if the bang had been an anomaly, a glitch in the otherwise perfect stillness. It was then that Emily realized the true strangeness of it all. They weren't just on a planet where sound didn't travel, they were on a planet where sound didn't exist in the way they understood it. It was as if the normal rules of physics didn't apply here. The days that followed were filled with more strange occurrences. People began to report hearing voices. But the voices weren't coming from anywhere. At first, they were faint, just whispers that were hard to pin down. But then the voices grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to call people by name, beckoning them into the wilderness, into the forest. The whispers didn't just sound like noise, they sounded like people. Emily herself heard one, late at night, as she worked in her lab. It wasn't a voice from the outside, but something that seemed to come from within her own thoughts, like a memory half remembered. It whispered her name, her full name, but it was spoken with an eerie slowness. The words didn't make sense, but the tone, it was so familiar, it made her skin crawl. Emily. The voice seemed to breathe her name, and she felt an undeniable sense of dread. She spun around, half expecting someone to be standing behind her. But there was no one. No one at all. Is someone messing with me? She muttered to herself, her heart racing. But deep down, she knew the truth. Whatever was happening wasn't something that could be explained away by simple tricks or hallucinations. The next day, the phenomenon grew worse. A few of the researchers, those with more delicate temperaments, started exhibiting strange behavior. They would wander off into the forest, seemingly entranced, only to return hours later, their eyes wide with fear, claiming that they had seen something, some shadow lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the Scifiaudiobooks were watching them, aware of their every move. But how could an alien species control the very fabric of sound? She pored over her notes, tried to work through the science of it all, but the more she studied, the more she realized that the Scifiaudiobooks, if they existed at all, were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The answers were all in the silence. At the same time, the colony's leadership was becoming more concerned. Captain Clark had been pushing for more exploration into Kyleta's strange resources. The more they uncovered, the more valuable the planet became. But Emily's warnings about the unsettling silence were falling on deaf ears. Clark was too wrapped up in the promise of wealth and discovery. He had no idea what was about to happen. Neither did Emily, but the Scifiaudiobooks did. The next incident was a disaster. A research team went out into the deeper parts of the forest to study a cluster of strange, crystalline structures that had been detected through satellite scans. But when they didn't return on schedule, a rescue team was dispatched. Hours passed, and still, nothing. It wasn't until Emily and Clark arrived on the scene that they found the team. But they were not dead, they were gone. Completely, all of their equipment had been scattered across the forest floor, and their footprints leading into the dense foliage had simply stopped. No sign of struggle. No trace of blood. The only thing left behind was a single, strange mark carved into a tree, a symbol that resembled an eye, intricately detailed and unmistakably alien. Clark stared at the symbol, his face turning pale. "What the hell is this, Emily?" "I don't know," she whispered, a chill creeping down her spine. "But I think we've just angered the planet." And they were about to learn that anger had a voice that didn't need to make a sound. Clark stood frozen, staring at the symbol carved into the tree. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Emily felt the sudden weight of the air around them, the oppressive silence thickening, almost as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Who, or what, could have done this? Clark finally said, his voice trembling slightly. Emily didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing. There had been no sign of a struggle. No evidence of any animal or human presence beyond the scattered equipment, and certainly no clue about where the team had gone. The only thing that stood out was the symbol. It looked like something ancient, something deliberate. She'd seen designs like it in the research data she'd combed through in the past few weeks, ancient patterns from alien cultures. But it was a mystery now. A mystery that was beginning to feel less like an intellectual puzzle and more like a grave warning. "It's like they just vanished, she said quietly, trying to push back the growing panic. We need to get back to the colony. This isn't just some malfunction or accident. Something is wrong. Something's controlling this. Clark shook his head. I don't believe that. There's no way this could be some sentient species manipulating sound. We're just not seeing the bigger picture, Emily. This planet, he stopped, as though he realized he'd reached the edge of his own understanding. Emily turned away from him, looking toward the trees that seemed to loom taller now, casting longer shadows. The emptiness felt suffocating, like the forest was pressing in, surrounding them with its eerie, unnatural silence. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, no distant calls from animals. Just stillness. A deep, unsettling stillness. She had come to suspect it for days now, but standing here, in the heart of the forest, with no signs of life except for the faint impression of their own presence, she knew it was more than just a feeling. The Sena were real. And they were controlling the silence. The real question now was, how long would they let the humans remain before the balance tipped, before the creatures decided they no longer wanted to share their world? We need to get back, Clark, Emily said again, her voice more insistent this time. She started moving toward the path, trying to shake the creeping feeling that something was watching them waiting. Now. They left the eerie clearing without saying another word, moving quickly but cautiously, as if any misstep might send them tumbling into some unseen trap. The journey back felt longer than it should have. Every step felt like it was taking them further from safety, and yet, when they finally emerged from the dense forest, the path ahead seemed no less daunting. The colony's perimeter was a site of half-finished construction, with towering structures rising up against the barren landscape. It should have been comforting to see the familiar human structures: homes, laboratories, security posts, but it wasn't. It felt hollow, fragile, as though the entire colony was a house of cards, built too quickly and too recklessly on the edge of something dangerous. As they crossed into the main complex, Emily could see the fear creeping into the faces of their fellow colonists. People whispered in hushed tones, their eyes flickering nervously at the silence that had once been so comforting but was now unbearably suffocating. There was a growing unease. People were hearing things. Their minds were playing tricks on them. They thought they could hear voices in the distance, whispers that came from nowhere. The occasional scream, or laugh, or even a cry for help. And yet, when they went looking for the source of these sounds, there was nothing, just the vast emptiness of Kyleta. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Captain Clark's earlier dismissal of her warnings seemed foolish now, but he didn't see it. Not yet. His mind was still focused on the resources, the potential for scientific discovery. He'd promised to keep the team working. But Emily knew they were running out of time. Something on Kyleta was awakening, and it had been waiting for them. They gathered in the briefing room later that day, the atmosphere tense. Clark stood at the front, his arms crossed, looking every bit the commander, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something more guarded. Emily stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt the eyes of the others on her, a mixture of curiosity and doubt. "I don't know what the hell is going on," Clark began, his voice a little less steady than usual. "But something's happening. People are hearing things. Equipment's malfunctioning. Our communications with Earth are down, and we've lost contact with one of our teams in the field." Emily looked directly at him. "The team we sent into the forest. They're gone. And we found something. Something in the woods. A symbol." A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the room. Clark shook his head. "What kind of symbol? Something our team created?" "No," Emily said, her voice low but firm. "This was different. It's alien. Not something we could have made, or even understood. It's part of the planet, part of something else." Clark was quiet for a moment, his gaze flickering to the others in the room. "What do you mean, something else?" I think there's an intelligence here, Clark. Something that controls the silence. Something that, you're suggesting this planet is alive? That we've pissed off an alien species? Clark interrupted, his voice incredulous, as if the very idea were too outlandish to consider. Emily stood taller. Yes. But not just alive. It controls the sound itself. I don't think we understand the planet's ecosystem like we think we do. I think this silence, this lack of sound, is something the planet's inhabitants, the Sena, are using to communicate, she hesitated. To defend themselves. Defend themselves from us? Clark asked, his voice harsh with disbelief. We've been here for months. No one's been harmed. Not until now. Emily met his eyes, unwavering. We've only scratched the surface. You saw the symbol. You've heard the whispers. The Sena didn't make themselves known until now. And now they're trying to get rid of us. The silence is a weapon. Clark was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working over her words. Then, he shook his head. I don't believe this. You will, Emily said, almost as a warning. If we don't act soon, the rest of the colony won't survive. Clark turned away from her, pacing in thought. I don't know what to do. I can't just pull everyone out. Not yet. Emily felt her frustration building. We can't stay here, Clark. The Sena will make sure of that. We're a threat now. And they'll find a way to silence us permanently. The room fell into a heavy silence. For the first time, Emily wasn't sure if the weight pressing down on them was just the planet or something more. The growing realization that the people on Kyleta had become unwitting invaders was settling over her. And the Sena would not allow that. The next few days felt like they were in a race against time. Emily spent hours working with the other scientists, trying to study the alien flora and fauna in the hopes that anything would explain the silence, or the Sena, or the voices they were all hearing. But there were no answers to be found. No explanations. Just the haunting, constant hum in the air, a reminder that they were not alone, that the Sena were here, watching, waiting, and then it happened again. A colonist disappeared. It was Dr. Tally, the one who had been with Emily in the forest, and they first heard the whisper. He had gone out to gather more samples, but when he didn't return, they sent a search team. They found him lying in the forest, his body twisted in an unnatural position, his eyes wide with terror, but there were no signs of physical trauma. Just the look of someone who had seen something beyond their comprehension, and his ears were ruptured, as though something had torn them apart from the inside out. Emily looked down at the body, feeling a cold dread settle over her. This is it, she whispered. This is the price. Clark stepped beside her, his face pale. We can't stay here. We need to leave. Now. Emily turned to him, a fierce determination in her eyes. There's no leaving, Clark. Not now. Not anymore. The planet had made its decision. The rebellion had already begun. The silence that followed Dr. Tally's death was unbearable, oppressive. It clung to the air, heavy with unspoken fear, as if the planet itself was holding its breath in the wake of the tragedy. The body had been removed and sent back to the colony's medical bay, but the horror of what they had found was still too fresh, too raw in everyone's mind. Clark stood at the edge of the operations room, staring at the communications console as if hoping for some sign, some message from Earth to break the suffocating tension. But nothing came. The signal was dead. No messages, no response. Only static. And the static, Emily knew, was just another manifestation of the silence that Kyleta had become distorted, but ever-present. We need to act, Emily said, her voice firm, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. She turned to face the room, the faces of the remaining team members all fixed on her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. The Sena won't stop. They'll keep picking us off, one by one, until we're all gone. Clark finally turned to her, his face pale, but resolute. "What do you suggest we do, Emily? We can't just leave the planet. Not yet. We haven't even begun to tap into the resources here. There's too much to lose." "We've already lost too much," she replied, her voice low. "Dr. Tally is dead. We're losing communication with Earth. The Sena are making their move. The longer we stay here, the more they'll push back. They're not going to let us keep taking their planet's resources. We've invaded their territory, Clark. And now we're paying the price." "You're talking about abandoning everything we've worked for," he shot back, his eyes narrowing. "You want to pull out and leave it all behind?" Emily didn't hesitate. "Yes. I want to get everyone off this planet. I don't care about the resources. I care about our survival." For a moment, Clark just stared at her, his jaw clenched. Then he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "And what if we can't leave? What if there's no way out? What if we're trapped here?" "We'll fight," Emily said, her tone unwavering. "We'll fight for our lives, and we'll make sure no one else dies. But if we're going to survive, we need to get to the heart of this. We need to understand what the Sena want, why they're doing this." Clark paused, as though considering her words carefully. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. We're not leaving just yet. But we need to know what we're up against. I'll support your plan. But we'll do it my way. We'll gather a team and go deeper into the forest. Maybe we can make contact with the Sena, try to understand them." Emily felt a pang of disbelief. "Contact them? How? You saw what happened to Tally. These things aren't looking to talk." "We won't know unless we try," Clark said, his voice growing firmer. Emily shook her head but didn't argue. There was no time for that. If Clark was determined to take the fight to the Sena, then she would go with him whether she agreed with his approach or not. The team assembled quickly, a small group of 6 volunteers, each of them experienced in fieldwork but visibly shaken by the recent deaths. As they prepared to head back into the forest, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the mouth of some unseen beast, one that had been patiently waiting for them to make their move. The journey through the dense forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that gnawed at the edges of your mind, making you question your own senses. Every step felt like it echoed too loudly in the emptiness, the soft crunch of their boots against the undergrowth seeming too loud, too intrusive. Emily glanced over at Clark, who led the way, his face set in a determined frown, his eyes scanning the forest with the intensity of someone trying to outwit an invisible enemy. "Are we sure we want to do this?" Dr. Samantha Shaw, the biologist, asked from behind them. She was clutching a hand scanner, her face pale but resolute. "This doesn't feel right." Emily didn't answer at first. She wasn't sure she had any words left to reassure them. Every fiber of her being screamed that they were making a mistake, that they were walking straight into the heart of whatever had killed Dr. Tally. But she couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the whispers, the strange hums that haunted the night, the symbol carved into the tree like a warning. They moved deeper into the forest, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The trees seemed to bend inward, as if closing in on them. The air grew cooler, the stillness thickening with each passing step. It wasn't long before they came upon another strange sight, an array of twisted, crystalline structures protruding from the ground like jagged spires, their surfaces shimmering faintly in the dim light. "This is where we lost the last team," Clark said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "But this time, we're not just here to gather samples. We're going to find out what's really going on." Emily stepped forward cautiously, her gaze fixed on the structures. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before. The crystals hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, as though they were alive, pulsing with an energy that she couldn't quite explain. It was as if the very earth beneath their feet was vibrating in tune with the hum. She reached out, her hand hovering just above one of the crystalline spires, and for a moment, she could have sworn she felt it respond, a faint thrum passing through her fingertips. "Do you feel that?" she whispered to Clark, who was standing next to her. He nodded slowly, his expression serious. "Yeah. It's like the planet itself is alive, like it's communicating with us." Before Emily could reply, a sudden, sharp sound broke the silence. A crack, like a distant thunderclap, echoed through the trees. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Clark froze. What the hell was that? Another crack, closer this time. Then another. The entire forest seemed to shake with each sound. And then, all at once, the silence was shattered by a deafening roar, a sound unlike anything Emily had ever heard before. It was as if the planet itself was screaming, a low, guttural noise that reverberated in her bones. The roar was followed by a blinding flash of light. Emily shielded her eyes, instinctively stumbling backward. When the light faded, she looked up and saw the shapes in the distance, dark figures moving between the trees, barely visible, but unmistakably there. The Scifiaudiobooks, they were real and they were coming for them. The team scrambled, panic rising in their throats as the figures advanced, their silhouettes indistinct but somehow menacing. The silence of the forest had been broken, and now the air was thick with tension, with something primal and ancient, a force they couldn't understand but could feel deep in their bones. "Get to the clearing. Move!" Clark shouted, his voice barely carrying over the noise that was growing louder, closer. The Scifiaudiobooks were drawing nearer, their forms flickering in and out of view, like shadows crossing the dim forest floor. They were fast. Too fast. Emily felt the ground shake beneath her feet as the roar echoed again, closer now, like the planet was speaking to them directly, warning them to leave, to stop. But it was too late. They had crossed the line. The Scifiaudiobooks were not just a species, they were guardians. Guardians of this place, of the silence, and they would not let the humans invade their world any longer. As the team sprinted toward the clearing, the ground cracked open beneath them, and a wave of seismic force sent them tumbling to the ground. Emily landed hard on the forest floor, pain shooting up her side. She looked up, dazed, and saw the others scattered around her, all struggling to regain their footing. Then, from the darkening forest, the Scifiaudiobooks emerged, their forms more solid now, like shadows given shape, towering and ethereal. They were humanoid, but their features were alien, their skin translucent and shimmering like the crystals in the forest. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were swift and deliberate. They were silent as death, their presence a living nightmare. Clark reached for his weapon, but Emily caught his arm. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't fight them. Not like this." The Scifiaudiobooks stopped a few feet away, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans. And then, in a voice that echoed not through the air but directly inside Emily's mind, came the words. "Leave." The word was clear, sharp, and resounding, but not spoken aloud. It thrummed in Emily's mind, deep and reverberating like the pulse of some ancient, unseen power. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, a command not just to her ears but to every part of her being. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, trying to make sense of it. The Scifiaudiobooks stood in a half-circle around them, their translucent, shimmering skin almost glowing in the dim forest light. Their eyes large, unblinking, and alien were fixed on Emily, Clark, and the others, as though appraising them. There was no hostility in their gaze, but there was something else, something deeper, an unspoken warning that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the forest, the soft rustling of the trees above, and the distant crackling of something far off in the dark. Emily could feel the weight of the Scifiaudiobooks' presence like a physical force pushing against her chest. They were waiting for a response, for a sign that the humans understood the gravity of their situation. Clark took a step forward, his hand on the hilt of his sidearm, his jaw tight, but the weapon still holstered. He wasn't foolish enough to think they could fight their way out of this, at least not yet. But the defiance in his posture was clear. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice loud, defiant. "This planet is ours now. We've claimed it. The words hung in the air, the silence between them thickening in response. The Sena didn't flinch, didn't show any reaction, but there was something in the stillness that sent a chill down Emily's spine. It was as if the forest itself held its breath. Then, in a fluid motion, one of the Sena stepped forward, its form shifting and blurring as it moved. It was taller than any of the humans, its body glowing faintly, its limbs thin but strong, like something that existed on the edge of the visible spectrum. It was humanoid, but not in any way Emily had ever seen. Its face, or what she assumed to be a face, was smooth, almost featureless except for the dark, luminous eyes. There was no mouth, no nose, no discernible markers of expression. It raised a hand, an elongated limb that seemed to stretch and shimmer in the half-light of the forest. The air around it shimmered, vibrating with the same pulse that Emily had felt earlier when touching the crystal spires. The Sena's presence seemed to warp the very fabric of reality itself. "Leave." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a thought. It echoed through her mind like a psalm, its resonance filling her head, reverberating in her chest. "You are intruders." Emily took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the air around them charged, as if the entire planet was alive and aware of their presence, waiting to either annihilate or embrace them. "We won't leave," Clark repeated, his voice shaking, though he tried to maintain the bravado. "We came here to stay. We're settlers. We have a right to." The Sena's eyes flickered, and suddenly, the air around them seemed to twist and bend. The forest groaned, its branches creaking as though the planet itself was pushing back. A low growl, something primal, reverberated from deep within the earth. Emily felt it more than heard it, a vibration that rattled her bones. "You are not wanted here." The voice rang out again, louder now, echoing through her entire being. "This world is ours. You have taken what you do not understand. Leave before it is too late." Clark flinched, his resolve faltering for just a moment. But then he squared his shoulders, his face hardening. "I'm not leaving," he said again, his voice filled with defiance. "Not until we've learned everything we can. This planet's resources." The silence is the first warning. The Sena's voice came again, cold and sharp, cutting through the air. "The Earth speaks to us. It listens. It will not suffer you any longer." The ground beneath their feet trembled again, stronger this time, as though the Sena were willing the earth itself to rise against them. Emily stumbled, clutching at her side. She felt the power surge through the soil, an invisible force making the air vibrate and hum. "Clark!" Emily shouted, her voice raw, desperate. "We have to leave. They're not bluffing." But Clark, stubborn as ever, shook his head. "I'm not running from this. We're not cowards." He took another step forward, his hand tightening around his weapon. "We've come too far." The Sena didn't move, their figures almost shimmering in the dim light. But Emily saw a flicker of something in their eyes. A shift. A recognition. And then, without warning, one of the Sena raised its hand and snapped its fingers, a sound like the crack of thunder splitting the air. The effect was immediate, the silence shattered, the forest erupted around them. The trees groaned and cracked, the ground splitting open as roots and tendrils burst forth from the earth, coiling around the humans' legs like serpents. The air was suddenly filled with an agonizing, high-pitched screech, a sound like 1,000 nails dragged across glass. The very atmosphere seemed to vibrate with an intensity that made their ears ring, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unnatural, rhythmic beat. Emily dropped to her knees, her hands clutching her head, trying to block out the overwhelming sound. The pressure in her skull was unbearable, like the very planet was trying to crush her. She could hear Clark shouting, but his voice was lost beneath the cacophony. He was still trying to resist, still fighting, but the force of the Sena's presence was too much. She saw him collapse to the ground, clutching his ears, his face contorted in pain, and then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The oppressive silence returned, deeper than before, thick and suffocating. The ground stopped trembling. The trees stopped groaning. The air felt heavy with an overwhelming sense of finality. Emily struggled to stand, her body shaking. She looked around, trying to focus, but the world seemed to blur and spin around her. Clark was on the ground beside her, gasping for air, his face pale and covered in sweat. The rest of the team was scattered, some on their knees, others collapsed on the ground. No one moved. The Sena stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans, their forms barely visible in the dim light. Leave. The voice was not a thought now. It was a command, cutting through the silence like a blade. You are no longer welcome here. Emily staggered to her feet, her mind swimming. She wanted to argue, to push back, but there was no fight left in her. The Sena had made their point. The planet itself had made its point, and she understood. For the first time, she understood what the Sena had been trying to say from the beginning. Kyleta was not just a planet. It was a living, breathing entity, an ecosystem that was in perfect balance until humanity had arrived. The silence, the absence of sound, it wasn't just a strange quirk of the planet. It was its defense mechanism. The Sena weren't just protecting their territory. They were protecting the very essence of their world. The humans had intruded. And now, there would be a price to pay. Clark, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she helped him to his feet. We have to leave. It's over. Clark didn't argue. He looked around at the Sena, his face pale and drawn, the weight of his stubbornness now crushing him. He nodded slowly, his expression hollow. We're leaving, he said, his voice barely a whisper, and with that, they began to retreat, the sounds of the forest eerily silent once more, as the Sena watched them go, their glowing eyes following their every step. End of story.